document early this morning that was a definition of metadata. So the first task that we had was to see if we could put some terms around this. Malcolm, are you on the phone?
No, he is not on the line yet.
Okay, well, if you see him show up, I'm going to ask him to send his picture to you so we can show that as well. In the meantime, we can just pull up the document as you suggested, Carol, so people can see that rather than a blank screen. Okay,
no problem.
So I went through a bunch of definitions of metadata. I will start by saying that I understand why we have a problem in describing and positioning metadata. It's not very clear when you look at all the content circulating around on what it is and how to describe it. So I tried to extract some various things that I found. So I think the first thing that I found was this core definition. So everybody got a copy of this document, and make sure now it's up on the screen. So I extracted everything that I could find into this core definition, right? Metadata is structured information that identifies stuff, describes stuff, and explains stuff, tells you where that stuff is, tells you how you can get hold of it. And I think that's exactly what we are trying to define with metadata. So let me pause there for a second, make sure everybody understands where we're going and what I've got here.
While you pause, just
to take silence as a complete consensus.
This is Jim Halcomb. I like the definition except for the use of the word enterprise.
What's wrong with the word enterprise, Jim? Too broad?
Actually, too restrictive. It isn't always. The rest, an enterprise could be, but it could be, it could be at a different level in the organization and still qualify as metadata.
Yeah, this is John Gemsky. Yeah, I kind of agree with Jim's comment because when you think about it, I would consider our semantic repository work as a form of metadata because it's really defining some business needs and rules and so on. And in that case, it's wider than enterprise.
Right, so we could simply say that this describes, explains, or provides location details about information and enables users to retrieve, if that makes you a little more comfortable.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, good. And then when I looked at I guess it was the National Information Services Organization, I can't remember what it stood for. I found these three concepts, which I then searched around and created some definitions around. So I think they are reasonably comprehensive in terms of the types of metadata that exist, right? So what they described was descriptive data. That's kind of like the card catalog, where you can find information. And basically, this is what people mean when they say data about data. So this is data about the content. There's the structural stuff. I guess you could also call that the technical stuff. It talks about how data is organized, the file structures, and underlying repositories of data. This is data about the containers, is what it was as it was described. And then there's administrative. Administrative says, when it was created, how it was created, what it's used for, intellectual property right protection, things of that nature. So let's take a moment there and make sure that everybody is comfortable that is. When I was thinking of how do you start broad categories, and then how do we then take those categories down to the specifics?
Can we increase the can we just focus on the first page? I'm having a little trouble reading it.
I can make it certainly larger.
Just,
this has all been sent to you, so you should have a document. It might be easier to look at the
That's
document.
true. Fair point. And I do have it open.
But yeah, you can do this as one page, I think.
hey, Mike. This is John Gemsky again. Yeah, I had trouble with this, with the categories. The problem is where in this categorization would you give the business meaning of a specific field? Because I couldn't see where that would be.
So if you looked at the metadata subject areas under descriptive, I would put business definitions in that bucket.
Yeah, but you see, under descriptive metadata, in that first sentence, in that first section there, it talks about the information used to search and locate, and the examples are titles. Yeah, I search by titles, abstracts, authors, keywords, and publishers. It doesn't say anything about the actual data content. You have to realize that the people who wrote this seem to be more in the library
Publishing
area,
world,
the general, because right away. Well, here's my thinking. In the half hour between conference calls that you gave us this morning, I looked at it and I see that in other ones also have a different category for what they call guide metadata. And guide metadata really falls into more what this is saying as descriptive metadata. Where guide metadata.
Say that word again, John. Guide.
Guide. As in G-U-I-D-E. Yeah.
As opposed to guys.
Yeah. Well, it's a guide. In other words, these are the things that help you guide you to getting the metadata to where it is. It's really more the search criteria.
Well, it's interesting, John, as I think about what you're saying. I could see where the definition, business definition of your data would help you to find it or guide you to it. It also, I don't know, I need to maybe understand a little bit more about what's intended for administrative, but the things that the metadata that you would use to manage your data, to manage quality in your data and things like that, would metrics and ranges and domain values and definitions all be metadata that you would use in order to manage quality in your data. So I'm trying to find where.
Yeah, well, let's just step it up one level, Jim, and say, listen, I wanted to talk about content versus technical versus administrative. So we can redefine these things, but I just wanted to make some clarity, at least in my own mind, of the various types of metadata that exist, so we can then have a way of talking about it.
Sure.
So does that resonate with you, or does that trouble you?
Norman Steele has raised his hand. Now, Norman is on voice over IP. I'm going to try and release your line, Norman, so you can speak. If there's a problem, I'll have to put you back on mute. Norman, can you hear us?
Hi, Samer's here as well. Can you hear us?
Perfect.
Okay, go ahead. Go.
You have a question?
No, I just wanted to make sure you can hear us to comment when there's time. So sorry,
Not a problem. Not a problem.
We were just trying to get
so if at all possible, in all of these things, if you could dial in on the telephone, we can just release you. There's never any problem with background noise. It makes the world a lot easier. If you can't do it, then Carol's going to have to release you, have to raise your hand and things of that nature. So just in the future, please, if at all possible, dial in on a telephone.
we
Okay, so does anybody have a a thought about kind of the broader objectives that we're trying to do, and then we can put some definitions around them. Go ahead.
No, I think that was feedback coming from the line. Norman, I've actually put you back on mute. Raise your hand if you have questions, and I'll happily release the line.
Okay, so Jim, let's just you and I battle it out and let people join in as they can.
Well, first of all, this is Steve Kowalski from Bank of America. Just one other category. I guess you could say it's a piece of administrative metadata, but what we call in the bank metrics or measurement metadata. So things kind of one step removed from the definition of it, but things like data quality metrics. And there's, I know under Section 2C it talks about environments for QA, but I'm talking about the actual results of QA. Because in a broader
you know, and I stuck metrics into descriptive data because I thought that under descriptive data there was something called data content, and that includes the validation rules and the metrics about data. So I kind of
agree with that.
There.
I agree because I'm thinking that I like the way that you said content, container, and then that makes sense to me. You've got your content, you've got the stuff that the content's stored in, and then you have your managing of it. And the metrics from a content perspective help a user understand what the content is. It enables that. So it seems like that's the right place, but I could also see somebody arguing to put it in administrative, but I like where you're wanting to put it.
I think that we should all recognize that these things all exist. So it's not like we're trying to not include it, but I'm just trying to organize it a little bit so we can talk about it. So the question is metric-based metadata important enough to be in its own category because we're going to either manage it differently or we're going to talk about it differently, and I'm fine with that. I think that's the question on the table.
Well, from a management
I didn't catch your name, whoever brought that question.
One of the things that we're dealing with at the bank right now has to do with defining retention schedules for metadata. And one of the fundamental differences between a lot of the descriptive metadata versus metric measured metadata is that the descriptive metadata is largely going to be tied to the life cycle of the repository that contains the described data, whereas the retention schedule for metric metadata is going to be tied more to the life cycle of the specific instances that are being measured. So in other words, I mean, data is periodically being purged from an operational database.
Right.
All your descriptive metadata is retained as long as that database is still in operation. But the metric metadata is related to individual data, and as that data gets purged, the metrics about that data become increasingly less of interest to us. So there is at least that management distinction, I think.
You know, I think that's a point. I understand that. So it sounds like we have data about our metadata itself, how long we retain that, and what we do with it, and then we have the content, and those are not the same thing.
I think the retention speaks more to the actual content than the metadata. Is that correct, or are you saying that you've got retention schedules with respect to your metadata as well?
Yeah, we are actually defining, because what we are finding is our security group, like what they want to do is come in and just treat metadata as a piece of the data which is described by it. And our point is that you have at least these two classes of metadata from a retention schedule. So in other words, the things like name of a data element, size of a data element, well, if record, the record for customer 123 is in the database or not, the structure of the database is the same, and customer ID is still a 10-character field. But if you're doing metrics on your customer data and you have a measurement for the data quality of the instance of customer 123, and then customer 123 ceases to be a customer, so we remove that from the repository at some point. So information about that particular record, ceases to be relevant, but metadata which describes the structure of a customer record is still relevant.
Absolutely.
So it's not. So it's not just a question. So in both cases, it's a question of retention of metadata, but one is retention of metadata as it applies to the description of the container, and one is metadata as it applies to the contents of the container.
Right. So which just, I think, reinforces the value of keeping those categories clear.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important. As we're talking about this, I think the distinction of metadata about the container versus metadata about the contents is, I think that's very fundamental.
So just keep this in the back of your mind as we go through this, because at the end of the day, if we can roll it up to 3 categories or so, it becomes a little easier to talk about it, and we know then what we mean. I then went through. Go ahead. What's that question?
Yeah, Mike, this is John. John
Hey, John.
Getsky again. Yeah, I've been reading while you've been talking, and I see that I looked up, and Kimball, who is obviously a recognized, very important person in this industry, he actually says the same 3 categories. He just names them different. Instead of descriptive metadata, he calls it business metadata. Instead of structural, he calls it technical metadata. And instead of administrative, he calls it process metadata. And I was just thinking that maybe his terms are a bit more understandable as to what these things are.
I have no ownership over this language. As I said in my note, I got back from travels and did this yesterday. So, we can. I made a note that they are some synonyms here. In fact, I think we've kind of created our own as well. In our conversation, we said that business or descriptive data is about content.
Right.
And we said that structural is really about the container.
Yep.
Right. And we left admin as admin, but you've now suggested process. So I think that. So the question then, John, is the concepts are still captured regardless of the nomenclature, right? So we could argue about the nomenclature.
Right. Yeah. I agree. At this point here, I would agree that these are 3 major categories. Probably that your first page where you had descriptive metadata, the definition there, probably needs to be more generalized to talk about, definitions about, more data about the content, the description of the content, rather than just the search criteria.
So let's look down underneath the subject areas. And if you want to scroll down on the page, and I think we're trying to get 1 page here, Carol, if at all possible. Under the content or the business stuff, I saw these 2 broad subject areas. I stole them from Malcolm. And then I added to it everything that I could find that I thought might fit in those buckets. So please don't hear this as anything more than what I found in my 2 hours of research. Right, so under the content or the business side of it, I saw data quality rules, data quality metrics, profiles, our semantics, our classification schemes, and our data taxonomies, and I put all that under content.
I would I would like to add business as well as quality rules, because there are business rules that exist that have meaning as well.
Yeah, but I think let me just remember what I put.
Or do you have that somewhere else? Or
business rules somewhere else, and I was having a little trouble trying to reconcile where the business rules went versus the content, the quality, the rules about quality. So I put business rules under business architecture in the container.
Yeah.
So that would be 2B, and I'm perfectly comfortable changing this around.
I from my experience, business rules and calculations are very much a part of content.
Yeah, and I had it there initially. I just kind of moved it at the very end.
Yeah.
So, so I agree with you. It wouldn't be hard for me to convince that the calculations, algorithms, business rules are content.
I mean, it's true that they are also reflected in your architecture and how the data is automated. In your ETL and things like that, you find the business rules have been implemented and impose restrictions on your structure. But that's my preference anyway. I'm totally open to.
Okay, so the thought is to move business rules under data content.
Well, this is John again. What I would say, Mike, is you really need to expand descriptive metadata and have it. I would think you need to add data identifiers as a separate topic, because that's where the NISO definition was going, where in fact, how do you identify a field? How do you identify an issue? How do you identify, the LEI? They're all metadata. So I
certainly agree with that. I kind of put that under classification and semantics and all that includes identifiers. But we should spell this out as broad as we can, John. So I've added that.
And I'm also thinking, who is the gentleman from Bank of America? I didn't catch your name.
David Kowalski.
David Kowalski? David, what I was hearing you say that's got my wheels spinning a bit is I'm wondering how if it's going to be possible to pigeonhole certain types of data into particular metadata categories, or if it's a depend situation. In other words, if there's like a matrix of data types against these categories, and you might find some types of data that hit more than one category depending on the situation.
Yeah,
I don't want to
think
make
that
this unnecessarily complicated, but that's what I was hearing you say.
Certainly in the case of, I think you can make an argument. Well, we use a slightly different taxonomy at the high level when we classify metadata within the bank. But I mean, for instance, data lineage. Ours is more around. It's similar to this, but we define it as definitional, operational, and and then business metadata. And certainly something like data lineage, there are aspects in which it's definitional, and there's aspects in which it's operational. So I think no matter what your taxonomy is around this, I think you're likely to find some things that are not a real neat fit, especially if you're looking at relatively coarse categories. So I agree.
Yeah,
so David, I understand definitional, but give me some explanations about operational and then what you described as business.
Yeah.
Well, the operational would be closer to what we're calling structural in what you've got up here. So it's a combination of both the landscape on which, like things like in particular servers and things like that. We don't really have it formalized from a collection standpoint, but it could conceivably do things like have backup schedules and stuff like that on there. And then business is more kind of general lexicon type stuff. So it's, so one of the things we're very much dealing with right now is trying to come up with that kind of translation layer. So the business people can come in and say, describe things strictly in terms of business concepts, but then we can relate those to actual physical data elements and even logical data elements. So the business stuff.
How would that be different from a definitional category then?
Well, only insofar as the definitional stuff tends to be more related to the physical definition of the database, or the physical data elements, and logical. We're kind of like messing around a little bit with where we're actually going to put, how we classify logical data elements right now. There's unfortunately a few years ago, before the Enterprise Information Architecture Group really was formally formed and got involved in this, there were a couple of other kinds of terms around notions of like business element and stuff that got propagated around the organization, and we're kind of dealing with the aftermath of that now and what that means, and is a business element a logical data element, or is it actually something beyond that, and things like that. So
we love people that are going through reconciliation. It makes this task more relevant.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's drill down a little bit further. We'll kind of keep these synonyms. I'm going to try to keep a running list, because I'm hearing a lot of the same concepts, just a little different words. Just trying to make notes here. But if you look at the components of business or definitional or content or descriptive, we've now added business rules here. We've now spelled out identifiers. I also put reporting in there, and Jim, that's kind of where I put calculations and things of that nature.
Right.
And I guess an open question is, how granular do we need these subcategories, what's the value then of the granularity? I mean, can we have a big category called descriptive or business data, or do we need all these subcategories? How would they be used?
Mike, I've got a question. Melanie Mecker unfortunately has not got any audio. She has sent me a question saying she would suggest aligning with the DMBOK on the classifications, as that has traction and an installed base.
Well, except I spent a lot of time with the DMBOK, and it's not categorized at all. There's no explanation of things, and there was a lot of conflicts throughout the chapters on metadata. So that was my intent up front, and I did pull out from the DMBOK everything that I could find that I could understand what it was, and put it into these buckets, Melanie. So I agree with you that that was a body of knowledge that exists. This NISO stuff was a body of knowledge that exists, and I tried to incorporate them all into these 2 pages. So I realize you can't comment backwards. I love being able to refute your points without having you comment on them.
I'm sure she can type.
And I can feel it being typed very fast.
No, she's actually responded. Apparently it has good definitions and examples for different types of metadata.
I'd love to see it, because if I was looking for that, and I might have missed it in my research. So does anybody else have familiarity with the DMBOK that could jump in on this? I have a copy of it, and I did do a somewhat of a search yesterday.
Mike, I thought also where you were going with how these categories might be used would be a good conversation.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out at the end of the day, how granular do we need to go and why?
In a previous project that I worked on, I used categories similar to David Kowalski's business and operational, only we had business, operational, and technical. And the way he described his definitional seemed consistent with that. And what we used it for was specifically in a BI project where we were trying to identify the things that within the BI, the business intelligence interface, we thought business users would most likely want to use or need to use, and to then, put the stuff that was considered, quote, operational, make it available but in a separate view, so that you had kind of a business view and then you had a deeper operational view, which is more like a business technical view of the data. Codes that may only be used in a calculation or to really kind of find the needle in the haystack. And then the technical was, as David described, the technical description of how the data was stored. The domain ranges, the codes, the technical definitions and locations of it within the data stores and things like that. So that's how we used, and we used that in terms of just how an interface was going to be designed, how to categorize the data, and who was going to own and manage it. So that was a use that we had. But I don't know if this is entirely consistent with what David was proposing, but that's my take on what he was describing and how I've.
Well, I think you're hitting upon the correct approach, Jim, because what we're really talking about is kind of a matrix, and it's a matrix of the goals that we have for doing this activity, which is how do you measure, position, govern, assure the quality of, and implement technically, and the degree to which those goals have to be measured against the granular structures of the metadata types, I think is the question that we first need to struggle with, because that will guide how we then look at the best practices and the measurement criteria and the language. So as you did that
Mike?
in your question.
Mike, this is Samara and Norm from Fannie Mae. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Oh, finally, thank you. So we have been listening. Our apologies for not being able to participate earlier. And so we have also put together sort of a high-level framework, and using the DM book and a number of other DEMA and other resources. So we can share that with this group. What I need to do is kind of remove this Fannie Mae proprietary elements out of that, and then I'll send it to you sometime later this week or perhaps early next week, and you can share it with the group.
Yes, thank you, Sam. I will post all this up on the web as soon as I get it with permission to share it.
And in terms of,
go ahead, Sam.
No, and in terms of, I think the way we have been thinking about it, and a lot of it is really what the group has been talking about, is business metadata, technical metadata, and within that sort of the runtime metadata versus sort of a more static design time metadata, operational metadata, which I actually heard a lot of good examples, right? And then unstructured metadata, which for us at this point, we're not ready to tackle it. So in terms of how we categorize things are, within those 4 domains.
So you add unstructured data as different than kind of content, even though it's just a category within?
Yeah, we did simply because it's a slightly different beast in our view, and we just in terms of our ability to deliver something, we just weren't ready to tackle that. I think there's a lot of relevance in the unstructured space. Obviously, it just from our perspective is something that we know we need to tackle. We're just not there. So
in terms of it's important to recognize as a concept and to be able to talk about. So you made it a separate category, if you will, under content.
Exactly. And honestly,
I'm still hearing under content. I mean, under definitional, the data content itself, the reporting about it, and now I've added unstructured data to it. Is that a fit with your view?
This is at least world according to us. And I have to say, this is, we don't want to take the sort of intellectual property of this. This is based on the research and sort of the DEMA stuff that's out there as well. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, we came up with this. So again, it's, you know, kind of how we put together these categories that would fit our need for what we need to deliver. Yeah, but a lot of information is out there. It's, you know, I just want to make sure people don't say, well, this is, you're just copying them a book, and we are.
Actually, no, but that's, I appreciate your intellectual integrity, but I'm really curious how you actually, how well how you use it and how well it supports how you try to use it.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we are planning to do with metadata in general, right? So we kind of started this journey a couple of years ago, and what we immediately recognized is it's easy to start with the technical side, right? Scanning all your databases and scanning your reporting layer and all that. But what we didn't want to do is kind of turn it into a technology project, right? So what we did was, as part of our governance program, which is led by another colleague of mine, right? We partnered and kind of tried to tackle it from a governance perspective in terms of who are the custodians of the data, who are the trustees of the data, and what's the governance process around that, and what are and how do we go about building a Fannie Mae sort of a vocabulary, right? Which so that was this beginning part of it, and as part of that, the governance team put together a list of what we call the core data set, right? The data that is critical to our business transaction, and it kind of goes across these different boundaries of business. So the first thing that it's thank you. The whole team behind it. I'm just the speaker here. So that was the first step. Then the second step, which we're kind of undertaking right now in that space, is we are working with our business and technology partners in general, and we're building our canonical model, right? And then the sort of guiding principles there are similar, right? We have to model the what we call the core data sets that I just described, right? But we're also not taking it further, right? For each line of business, right? We're asking them to help us model and rationalize that data set, model so in our case, right, we have a delivery side of the business, right? We're working with that business unit right now to kind of see what are the shared data points, right, that we want to model at the enterprise level, at the logical level across the enterprise, because we don't want to model everything, right? So that's sort of the second layer of the business, what we consider business metadata, right, which will help us build a Fannie Mae language. Just to share some of the pain points that we had, or some of the kind of the journey has been difficult, as I'm sure everybody can attest to, right? What we so 5 years ago, Fannie Mae decided to do an enterprise level model, and it was very difficult, and they decided that we're not going to do that, so let's go ahead and bring in an industry model. And then to that end, we tried to bring in the IBM model, you know, and we just couldn't make it work because the language was very difficult for us to adopt. It was very different. It was highly normalized for a different set of.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
I don't want to interrupt the flow too much, but I'm just wondering, what was the aim of, what were you trying to solve by bringing in an enterprise model? Was it language? Was it I don't want to give you too many options to choose from. I'm sure you
No,
have a
no,
reason. So.
I think you said it. It was definitely language, right? Because the way we're thinking about this, at the end of the day, it's not an academic exercise to get us to this just perfect language, right? At the end of the day, we want to make sure when we have our development, right, and we can do straight through processing, right? At the end of the day, it's how do we kind of move our systems and processes forward and improve time to market, right? And right now it's difficult because one, we have so many silos and we're unable to exchange data, right? And then
let me ask you a different way. What was it that you thought that the model was going to do that you didn't already achieve with your core data set?
No, wait, Jim. I think you're chasing this in the wrong direction, if I may. I'm hearing two things from Samra's story. One is, how do you govern content from a value perspective for the organization? That's about the language within the organization, and how do you govern that? The second one is, how do you implement that as models for practical delivery with established priorities? And that's where the data model comes into play, because that can be your implementation mechanism.
Gotcha.
But if you can't reconcile your language with the existing model, then you're going to be stuck in, kind of a translation hell, and that's not good.
Right.
So,
Thanks.
So, Samra, that's what I heard you say.
Mike, that was perfect. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. And sorry, since I'm closer to this, I'm in the weed, but that was perfect. Yes.
So, and I think
thank you for clarifying. I didn't mean to torture you, Samra.
Ultimately, that's the goal of this activity, is to understand what the purpose of this metadata is, and what its value is to the organization, and how we manage it, position it, ensure its quality, implement it, and make it work. And I think that we're now trying to kind of look, step one step at a time through this by saying, in order for us to do that, one of the things we have to do is come up with a language about the metadata so we can talk about it. And so I'm hearing high-level goals, Samra, and I'm hearing lots of individual objectives, and I'm still fishing for how granular we need to define metadata in order to achieve the lower-level objectives of governing, positioning, ensuring quality, and implementing. And I'm kind of leaning toward more granular, because that's probably how you manage your data. One more litany before I go on, because I think about kind of two sides of this equation. One is how you, the professional, will be managing the data, and then how you have to then sell the concept and the value of the metadata work to stakeholders and to those who hold the funding purse. And they're not going to be the same thing.
So I'll give you my perspective, and I think Norm and I think John Clark is on the call. They probably have a slightly different perspective as well. So from my perspective, I agree with you that we need to drill down, into a little more detail, because at the end of the day, it's about how do we provide the metrics that we can share across the enterprise, right, and then measure it. I think one of when I spoke with you, right, when we met in New York, was we're having a really hard time measuring the program in a really objective way, right? We are close to it, so we work hard and we think we are moving the dial, right? But is it really, are we too close to it? And how do we measure that, right? And how do you, if you do a maturity assessment against metadata, right? How do we make sure we know where we are, and if we are in a lower maturity level, what are the 5 things that we need to do, right? And I think those 5 things, I'm just using that as an example.
But we should put that in the how do we do metadata better from a data management professional's perspective. I think that's what you're describing.
Yeah, and also
right?
I think people, yes, yes, Mike. And I think there are different perspectives, right? In our case, we want to make sure we develop the language, right? And we want to make sure we have a canonical model by which we are everybody speaks that language. But for somebody else, maybe slightly different, right? They may wanna, the only thing that they want to target is how do they fix their warehouse and business intelligence metadata, right? And that may be the extent of their it's sort of objective. So I think we should allow for these variances in goals and objectives within this framework of, metadata maturity model that we're trying to put together. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But the if it's less granular, it's easier for us to define, I think, the criteria for management and measurement and maturity assessment. And if I hear you correctly, the things you still care about can be reduced to language and implementation.
Yes.
Yes. Those are those. We don't need to get real granular on the data because basically all of it's in scope is what I hear.
Yes, and yes, that's correct. We just have to frame it in a way that if somebody decides to do one part of it, that doesn't mean that they are always at the maturity 0.5 just because they decided to do, just to allow for goals also. And I don't know, that may be too difficult. There may be a difficult dimension to add to this. I don't know.
Well, to some degree, the checklist of the metadata content types is going to be important because that's what you're going to be measuring. Are we good in our business definitions? Are we good in our data quality validation rules? Are we good in our ability to identify our core data attributes? All of those things.
And we link
things you want to be good. You want to measure.
Yeah.
So earlier you were saying you had 3 or 4 points: governing, positioning, implementing. And I'm sorry I didn't get them all, but
I'll say them again: positioning, governing, assuring quality, and technical implementation is what I'm hearing you all say.
So when I hear that and I say, what are we trying to measure to show progress? There are many different ways that can count numbers, but they don't necessarily add value. I've read, we've scanned in 20 models. Well, what value is that to the business? And so when I try to reframe it based on the conversation today, I look at it and say, well, governing helps control the vocabulary. We're establishing the vocabulary that gets governed, one at an enterprise level. So we actually have counts there. You could break that down further by saying what matters for that vocabulary, quality of the definition, or whatever other sub-items may be there. Those are all quantifiable and have meaning to the business. You can also down a layer and say, well, we're not only controlling vocabulary from the top down, but we can also control it from the bottom up. As the business units grow and their data has not necessarily risen to the enterprise level, we can measure the same thing at that layer. Then there's the implementation of it. It's implemented in where? Glossaries, models. It may be in reports. So you can define what types of objects is this vocabulary contained in, and then you can measure your growth on those items, which would have real measurements and show real gain. I think beyond vocabulary, you can then start looking at things like relationships for traceability. My glossary is connected to my model, which is connected to my database schema, which is connected into a business objects or business intelligence type of report. That's one type of connection called traceability. And so you could measure how well connected in the traceability mode are we. Then you have a lineage relationship. The data is hopping along from one point to another. That's a different measurement. And so I think that we can probably go down and define additional things besides vocabulary, traceability, and lineage on things that we could measure. But each of these adds some type of business value that I think would help to quantify and have a common way of describing it.
And I hear from that, in essence, the same two objectives that Sarah was laying out. So your value to the organization really is why Sarah was talking about language, and your implement, how do we get it implemented technically is the other side of the equation.
Right.
And fundamentally, everything should be looked at through those two lenses.
Yes.
That's why we work well together.
Oh, you're the same organization? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's Norm.
Oh, no, I thought, okay, good. I thought we were getting consensus across the group.
But the reason I put that out there, though, is if we agree with this, can we enumerate those lists a little further? So not just vocabulary, traceability, and lineage. Are there other kinds of relationships that we think would add value to count? And is there agreement on these across the folks that are on the call?
What about quality?
Well, quality's definitely got to be in there. One of the things I find is if your metadata doesn't have what I would call metadata quality, people run away from it. They stop using it. So I think you also have certain dimensions that are slightly different than the typical data quality dimensions. I think metadata quality has its set. One of which is the types and number of relationships that you establish. That's not normally there with regular data. Is it current?
Yeah, but doesn't relationships become part of your lineage category?
It goes beyond lineage. Relationships can also be traceability. They can, is your glossary connected to your model? And so that's a connection that's not necessarily lineage. So I think relationships cut across a lot of types of, or more than one type of thing, which is why I wanted to see if we could enumerate more of them. Right now, our maturity level gets us to traceability and lineage. There may be others that, a year from now we may be talking some more.
Well, Norm, I just want to make sure I get it, understand it. So I heard kind of 4 big categories of things you measure: vocabulary, traceability, lineage, and then I added quality. And I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting what you're saying.
You're correct. We're still in the stages of defining metadata quality.
Oh, I think all of these things will be defined and argued about, but we're trying to put some structure around what is a massive amount of stuff, and that's the challenge I think that we all face.
Yeah. So for now, I think.
How do you? I'm sorry. Before you go, one more question. How do you measure the level of your technical implementation? Where does that fit in your 4 categories?
That would fit under the technical metadata. So within that, right, is the traceability and lineage that we have undertaken for sort of a design time metadata. So for now, to Norm's point, that's how we're measuring ourselves. Do we have the linkage necessary across the different layers of architecture, right? For instance, from our logical model to our physical model, from there to our database schema and reporting layer. So that's one sort of use case that we have, and we will measure ourselves in terms of adoption for that. And then the second thing that we are working on right now is the capability for lineage. And that we kind of think of that as our ability to trace data from the point of entry or the system of record to the point of consumption, whether it's a database or it's a report. So for now, we are measuring ourselves across those two dimensions of capabilities. And in the runtime metadata space, we're not there at all. We don't even have an opinion about how far we want to delve into that space.
Let me rephrase then what I think I'm hearing. So if we look at two sides of the equation, value and implementation or technical, from a value side, you're measuring vocabulary, traceability, data lineage, and data quality. From a technical side, you're measuring the linkage and flow of data as it moves through systems. Is there more we need to add to that side? Probably your integration challenges or some things of that nature, transformation processes.
Yeah, I'm wondering, where would you put the people? There are people involved in vocabulary and trade, and I guess, I could see where it could fit there, but I'm wondering if it needs to be on its own or just part of these four categories.
You mean, give me more on what you're asking.
Sure. So, for example, in vocabulary, you might have your governance activity of owners, stewards, or the language I heard from Fannie Mae was custodians and trustees. I'm assuming it's kind of referring to the same concept, but you'll have people who have responsibility for the vocabulary and maintaining it from an authoritative perspective, but then you also have people who are using the data and involved in its transformation over the life cycle of the data through the organization, and that I can think of people examples in each of these categories.
I put all this in the third bucket, Jim, when I was referring to administrative metadata types. I would add a third one from value and implementation to be governance, which is stakeholders, roles, responsibilities, stewards, owners, custodians, SLAs, audit requirements. All of that stuff kind of becomes the third category from my vantage point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see you've got that under administrative. That makes sense.
Yeah. This is John. Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. And actually, later on in your second page, you basically say that, where you have operations, data governance, and so on, as under administrative. It's really the people around it.
Yeah, but instead of structuring it, the only thing that's been kind of big shift for me, John, here, is that instead of structuring it as data types, I think what I'm hearing Fannie Mae say is they're structuring it from the application of the data to something. So some of it is business value, some of it is technical implementation, and some of it is administrative oversight. And that's a useful way of looking at it.
Yeah, but isn't that exactly what you have? The descriptive metadata is really the business, structural is really the technical, and then it's the administrative is the people and the processing around it.
Well, yeah, of course. I just stole this from the existing stuff, and I think we're all saying the same thing, which is good.
Yeah, we are.
We're just trying to get ourselves oriented because common view of this stuff is essential if we're going to be able to take it to its next steps.
Would I be oversimplifying if I were to say that those three categories pertain to what, where, and how? And if that's the case, is there anything that pertains to the why, like business case or business objectives or anything like that would be just to complete the interrogatives? Maybe I'm being overly simplistic in how I'm thinking about this, but
Well, it's not simplistic, but those are separate categories that we need to worry about, right? So if you look at the matrix idea that emerged from the earlier conversation, positioning it into the minds of your stakeholders is one of our goals, one of everybody's goals, and making sure we understand the value of metadata. And
that's the who, just to complete all of them. The who, what, when, where, why. So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure what those 4 W's do for me.
Well, the content is the what. I mean, what I'm aligning is I'm saying that the content is the what. That's essentially what we're managing, what we're talking about when it comes to metadata, and the structural.
So just be a little careful, because it's not just the content that I'm hearing Sam say or Norm say. It's also the data flows and the lineage of. So while the content, the what might be the content itself, the value, the business value, is also in traceability and lineage. So I'm hearing a little bit of modifications. Carol.
Sorry to interrupt you. A message through from Will Freeman. Two things, actually. Message from Will Freeman, and also I'm painfully aware that we're now overstretching the time limit of people's diaries.
And I'm going to get kicked out of my hotel momentarily.
No problem. So what Will has typed is, in event-driven architectures, making sense of constant streaming big data is a challenge. Historical observations that are captured may not be relevant until new data is captured. This is application orientated.
Mike, let me say something on this. This is John again. Yeah, he's absolutely right, and that's why I think Fannie Mae created that other category of unstructured data, because obviously big data is really unstructured data. And I don't know that it actually fits into, it fits a little bit into the descriptive and a little bit into the structural, but I don't know where.
Well, and I also agree that, it's really data content, and whether it's structured or unstructured, it's still about the data itself. So one of the questions is, how do you manage it? The other question is, what's the value of it to our organization? But you don't really need to create a separate category for unstructured data. It's just a form of content, I think.
Or the same can be argued for metadata, though. That the principles that you would use to manage your metadata, how different is that than how you would manage any other data? But we categorize it because it usually gets missed if you don't focus on it.
Oh, I don't think it should be categorized any different, Jim. I think it is data. It's critical data. It's in fact the map to the factors of input that drive your business. And what we're trying to say is, let's stop talking about it like it's some kind of technical thing and that nobody cares about. It is fundamental to your organization, and we got to stop. We got to elevate its profile. That's the whole point of this thing.
Exactly, and that's what I think I'm hearing them say about unstructured data. That the rationale for categorizing it is the same. But that's how I'm hearing it.
I captured unstructured data as a data type that needs to be looked at independently as part of content or business category. I'm just now looking at 2 dimensions of content. One is the type of metadata, and then the second one is the management of that data from a value and implementation perspective. So I'm certainly clear about that. All of these then need to be looked at in terms of our kind of how it's governed, how we ensure that it's quality, and how do we make sure that it is implemented technically within our organizations. I'm just not trying to put these 3 dimensions together. and we'll use that last philosophical comment as the conclusion of the meeting today. So I'm still in listening mode about this project itself. I'm going to try to recraft this definition with what I learned today, and then put it back in the context of the first two conversations we had about quality and governance, etc. Because, Jim, I think the goal here is, can we then start documenting the best practices of, in line with our data management maturity methodology?
Right.
And I think we're trying to get to that point of how we're going to approach it, and is that something that we can do that's valuable to our members?
Mm-hmm.
That's the filter from which I'm listening. So with that, I will call the meeting to an end. Thank you so much. We will reschedule the next one. I guess we're talking about what, every fortnight for this, so every 2 weeks. So I will try to set one up to 2 weeks hence. In the meantime, if you've got comments, call Jim.
Hey, Mike.
Hey,
this
John.
This is John. I only have one comment. Can you make this on another day other than the business entity discussion, so that we don't have back-to-back conference calls?
Yes. I hear that. Got it. Not Wednesdays.
Right. Either that, or just maybe every 2 weeks for that one and every 2 weeks for this one, and just alternate weeks, the same time slot.
We will figure that out. I understand. Let's not overburden the folks. Point made. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.